in 1981 in a handful of locations around the Portland, Oregon area. Supposedly, a rare video game was available to play at a select few arcades called Polybius. Over the years, several people have come forward with stories about their time with Polybius, describing it as an intense experience and very addicting. We're told that it was some kind of a space shooter and was very rewarding to play, but apparently the game was infamous for causing children to feel ill and experience disorientation, migraines, memory loss, insomnia, and horrible nightmares. They say men in black suits would enter the arcade to collect data from the machines, as well as the names of all of the people with high scores. And this has stirred up conversation wondering if Polybius may have been a psychological test implemented by the CIA, or perhaps a military recruitment tool. But here's the thing though, there's no proof that Polybius ever existed. Polybius, the game that may have never existed. Or is it the game that was covered up? Was Polybius real? Did the CIA use it as an experiment in the early 1980s? Or is this one of those things where people collectively misremember something, like a Mandela effect? Or was this just a hoax? When writing this video, I thought to myself, how do I talk about an idea when all I have is questions? And then I remembered. I have a series for that. It's called The thing is, it is possible that Polybius did exist because it wasn't uncommon for a new game to spend a short period of time in an arcade and then get dismantled and completely forgotten. There are lots of games that only saw a short career in an arcade and then never got released for home consoles. Unreleased games would see a short fate like that all the time. However, there's just simply more reason to believe that Polybius never existed, because there's no record of a Polybius ever being on display at an arcade, and there's no record of anybody ever playing the game. But I still think that a subject like this is worth discussing in a video, because even if it's not real, it still lines up so perfectly with everything that we know about the kinds of mental experiments that the CIA was running back in the 70s and early 80s. And I've also mentioned in past videos that people seem to understand very well how our dopamine responses correlate with video games. So it's fun to think that maybe they did do something like this. I mean, if the CIA knows how to manipulate our dopamine responses on a screen, they would have had to have learned that somehow. So maybe it was through things like Polybius or through things like arcades. There doesn't appear to be any legitimate photographic or video evidence of a Polybius arcade cabinet existing. The most common description said that it was mostly black with one red joystick and one white button. But I've seen other variations of it in mock-ups. However, allegedly, this is a screenshot of the Polybius start screen, which has been championed as the real thing across the internet. The game was copyrighted in 1981 by Sinneslosion. And of course, there's no record of Sinneslosion ever existing. Sinneslosion is technically German language, but it's not actually a German word. It's a fake compound word, Sinne meaning senses, and Slosion meaning delete. So Sinneslosion roughly translates into deleting your senses. That's a little ominous, even for a fake CIA company in charge of a psychological experiment. Even they don't make things that obvious. The very first mention of this Polybius game was on coinop.org. This site is supposed to be an archive of information about arcade cabinets, but the author of this post offered almost no information about Polybius besides categorizing it as an abstract puzzle game. There is no other reference to this game anywhere else before this time, but people have long speculated that the last Starfighter film, released in 1984, was in inspired by some of the rumors about Polybius. A story about a teenaged boy who gets the high score on a video game and is recruited to join as a starfighter in an intergalactic war. There's no way to know that any of this is true, though. In fact, there's no way to know that the Polybius myth even began before that 1998 website post, let alone in 1984. But this has spiraled into a cultural phenomenon. In fact, Polybius has been mentioned several times in pop culture, like The Simpsons. Like the freaking Simpsons. The Simpsons referenced it in season 18, episode 3. The family visits a defunct mall. Bart enters an arcade with machines dating back to the 1980s, and right next to him is a Polybius cabinet. This doesn't prove that Polybius is real, of course. It just proves that this was a cultural phenomenon. Even the angry video game nerd did a Halloween special where he plays a fake version of the cabinet that somebody made for fun, but he plays it off like they found it in the back of some old arcade storage or whatever. It's a fun episode. The version that he's playing looks pretty typical to the fake cabinets that I've also seen in the past. It's too modern, it's too clean. Back in the 80s, the marquee wouldn't have been so smooth and shiny. And the game that James is playing looks exactly how Polybius was described to me the first time I heard about it. A tunnel shooter style game. I played at least one game that was sort of like this in the early 90s. There are other fake versions of the game though floating around, and I think that the most widely accepted version of Polybius is this one that looks sort of like asteroids. I find it hard to believe though, there's nothing really mesmerizing or unique about this. But the thing is, there's reason to believe that a legend like this could be true, because there's reason to believe that these sorts of events could have happened in this time period. And I think that that's why this legend has endured this long. But as I discussed in my MK Ultra video, the CIA was running a litany of psychological tests on American citizens, so it's possible that they would want to run tests on children and families using media. One of the key details that keeps sticking out to me is that the game was supposed to be extremely addictive. So it's possible that the CIA or some agency was trying to hone in their skills on creating the most satisfying sound effects and special effects, trying to trigger children's dopamine responses. And there have always been rumors in gaming, for as long as there has been gaming, that some games are secretly military recruitment tools. I've heard that a few times. The most legitimate source that has ever mentioned Polybius is BBC, but even they did it as a novelty piece and they said it probably doesn't exist. But before that, the most legitimate source to ever mention Polybius was GamePro magazine back in 2003. Even they don't give the story any credibility, and they acknowledge that the story is just an internet phenomenon, but they do end the article by asking, what if it's true? So this might be a false memory created by a few different things, one of which is Polyplay, an arcade game that came out in 1985 that supposedly was something like 8 games in one. And if that's true, that would explain why there are so many contradicting stories about what the gameplay was actually like. Other things it might have gotten mixed up with, back in the 1980s, the United States military actually did commission a tank video game and used it for the purposes of training. So those kinds of things were possible. And in the 80s and even the 90s, there was a lot of illegal activity that happened in arcades. Often the arcade owners were selling and there were police raids, so it wasn't uncommon to see police or officials wandering around arcades, I guess. I remember seeing a few narcs. Shiny shoes. You look for shiny shoes, they're a narc, for sure. And more poignantly, the discussion about whether or not video games were healthy and the idea of people becoming ill because they were playing too many video games, that was already a huge discussion in the media back then. There were a lot of accounts of kids getting migraines from playing video games, and there was even a kid that died of a heart failure right after getting the high score on Berserk. That was like a video game legend. The hour-long documentary by Ahoy is probably the most comprehensive video that you can watch on Polybius. He describes the owner of coinop.org, Kurt Kohler, and explains that he was likely the one that was behind the hoax. Coinop.org was the first place that Polybius was mentioned, with no information about what it is. And the second place it was mentioned was in GamePro magazine. What I didn't tell you is they got their tip from coinop.org. So that was probably all just spin from Kurt Kohler trying to get traffic to his website. And what's funny is back in the 90s, in the early days of the internet, there was this popular viral story going around about a guy that wouldn't accept a $2 bill at a Taco Bell. I don't know the whole story, but it went viral, and Kurt Kohler was the one behind that story. And this, of course, Snopes says that that didn't happen either, So the point is, Kurt Kohler was really well practiced at stirring up fake stories on the internet and then making them popular. So the best guess is that Kurt Kohler was the one that began the hoax about Polybius, and he did that simply by creating a fake article about the game on his arcade website. So I think that Polybius probably never existed. But I do think that it's interesting how a legend like this can develop and get steam. And I think that this story is a showcase of the time periods that it's portraying. Both the fervor of the early video games industry, as well as the loose Wild West rules of the early days of the internet. But tell me what you guys think. Was Polybius real? Do you know somebody that played it? Or was it just an urban legend that spun out of control? Let me know in the comments section below, and smash that like button.